Welcome to the channel, That Retired Guy. Yeah, that's me, Darell. You know, that retired guy. Or should I say Darell John Dutton? That's right. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Dutton Ranch. Now, as I promised in the last video, Tractor Tales, check that out if you haven't already seen it. I'm going to chronicle the building of the Dutton Ranch. Now, you all are invited to ride along with me as this Canadian city slicker makes his way back to the land. And if it's ever been a dream of yours to own a piece of land or grow your own food or just return to the simpler things in life, well, you come to the right place. Okay, so where do I begin? Well, how about buying the land? Now, in my mind, I bought a ranch. Never let it be said that that retired guy bought the farm. I mean, at least not yet. Do you ever wonder where these expressions come from? They say that life insurance for a soldier in World War I was enough to pay off the mortgage on their farm. Well, I'm not banking on that. Anyway, I've now gone from a condo owner to a land baron. And as many of you know, Deborah and I have owned many houses and condos over the years. And we've lived in 3 different provinces, been snowbirds in 2 southern states. We also lived as expats in Budapest, Hungary for a couple of years. So we're no strangers to real estate transactions. In fact, my wife was a licensed real estate agent when we lived in British Columbia. I added up once. We bought and sold 21 properties in 49 years of marriage. That reminds me, I better not forget that next anniversary. Anyway, I digress. Back in 2020, my daughter-in-law had been looking at farm properties, and I mean, don't ask me why. She just likes looking at real estate for some reason. One night we got talking about how we'd both like to move out of the city, and soon after that we're looking for farms. You know, farms with a main house and a coach house for grandma and grandpa. That's me, grandpa. Well, long story short, finding a farm with a coach house is like finding a needle in a haystack. Or for another farm expression, it's rare as hen's teeth. Yeah, for all of you city slickers, hens don't have teeth. And in case you didn't know, they don't have a sphincter either. People say it's good luck if you get pooped on, and I'd say good luck with shining on the person walking next to me. You know, the one who didn't get blessed with that avian excrement. Right, Gary? Anyway, before the chickens come home to roost, I better get back to the story. So once we realized that we weren't going to find a 2-house farm, the only option left was to build our own. And that set us on the trail of finding some land. Now, I'm reminded of our visit to the King Ranch in South Texas. If you've never been, it's a tour worth taking. Richard King, the owner, is quoted as saying, "Buy land and never sell." Well, it's the largest ranch in North America, and it reached 1.2 million acres at one time. Now, the 5 acres that we bought, it's no match for the King Ranch, but we're land barons nonetheless. Now, in her song, "I'm Gonna Get You Good," Shania Twain sings, "You're a fine piece of real estate, and I'm going to get me some land." Well, that's just what we did. Ranch land, you know, home on the range where the deer and the antelope play. Okay, lots of deer, but no antelope. Now, let me show you what I'm talking about. So now, as you probably guessed, we're on the planet Earth. Elon Musk, he hasn't tapped me yet on the shoulder to join his Mars colony. And yeah, we are in Canada, the Great White North, up there in the Ottawa Valley. It's a 5-acre lot, not too far out of town, you know, close enough to drive the grandkids to school, but still away from the mad rush of the city. Now, I did a little research on the history of the land. It's fascinating stuff. I kind of wish now that I would have paid more attention to history class at school. I was too distracted by the girls back then. Yeah, I mean you, sweetie. Anyway, so the ranch is located in Cumberland Township. It's at the eastern edge of Ottawa. I was able to find some good resources, you know, books and such that take you back to the early settlers. And if you dig deeper, you can even find out about the native populations that were living here before that. There were actually archaeological surveys done in the area, and if you've been watching that Retired Guy videos, you know that my mother was an archaeologist. I learned from her that archaeological surveys are probably the most accurate account of history that you can find. So it was great to come across a survey done in the Cumberland Township. Anyway, let me tell you some of the interesting history of the Ottawa Valley and Cumberland Township. In the earliest recorded history, it talks about wars between the native tribes that hunted and trapped in the area. Now, at different times in the 1600s, you might find tribes of Mohawks or Algonquins, Mississauga, Iroquois, or even Hurons making a stand here. And by the time the early settlers arrived, the Hurons had been mostly wiped out. The Mohawks, the Mississauga had been pushed south, and the Algonquins and the Iroquois were left to battle it out with their kind of at different times allies or enemies, the British and the French. And by the early 1800s, through a combination of wars and disease, the native population had all but disappeared from the Ottawa Valley, such that the new settlers arriving to the area thought they were claiming empty land. The few remaining Algonquins had moved north to Quebec and northeast to Fort Colon near present-day Algonquin Park. The Dutton land, it's located in the Ottawa Valley in what was formerly called Cumberland Township. This township's on the southwest side of the Ottawa River, that is in the province of Ontario, since the river, it serves as the border between Ontario and Quebec. The river's 790 miles long. It's the main tributary of the St. Lawrence, where it joins at the city of Montreal just 100 miles east of Cumberland. The banks of the Ottawa River are most famous for the Canadian Parliament buildings, built in 1866, just a year before Confederation. They're a short boat ride up the river from Cumberland, or Oziel's Marina, as my family and loyal shipmates well know. We've cruised up the Ottawa River to see the Canadian Parliament buildings many times. And watching the fireworks on Canada Day from the river with my brother-in-law, who recently passed, is a special memory. Now, the Ottawa River was explored in 1613 by Samuel de Champlain. Of course, you remember this from your history lessons at school, right? Now, the river gets its name from the Algonquin word for trade. It was the main trade corridor from the Atlantic Ocean to the north and west of North America. It was the route traveled by the early explorers, the fur traders, missionaries, all traveling up to the upper Great Lakes. Now, lumbering became the dominant industry here in the early 19th century, and by mid-century it had become the economic engine of the region. Lumber was floated down the Ottawa River to Montreal in large rafts and then shipped off to Britain, primarily for shipbuilding. You see, Napoleon had blockaded the European trade with Britain because of the Napoleonic Wars, and this was their only option, was to get the lumber from Canada. Now later, New England lumber barons would come in and build huge sawmill operations and transport the sawed lumber to northeastern U.S. markets. The lumber business was the dominant industry in the area until the 1950s. Now, just upriver from Cumberland, in Bytown, what was called Ottawa now, a large contingent of poor Irish immigrants were busy constructing the Rideau Canal. It's a World Heritage Site. These men came penniless from the county of Cork in Ireland and did most of the hard labor. They lived in shanties on the banks of the river, and they'd built about 150 houses by the time the canal was finished. Now, as an interesting side note, have I mentioned before that on my mother's side family, that's Corcoran. I'm actually a descendant of the King of Cork in Ireland. Now, of course, it only seems fitting that our ranch would be near the early settlements and on land cleared by our Irish ancestors. Turns out that even before Bytown was incorporated, the part of Ottawa that's now referred to as Lower Town was actually the Irish settlement called Corktown. Coincidence? I think not. Okay, so you might ask, how do I know all this stuff? Well, turns out I do a lot of my research on beer cans. I mean, there it is right there. Anyway, another interesting fact I ran across while researching the early settlers was mortality rates. Now, many of the Irish laborers who came to build the Rideau Canal later settled here, and they died of malaria. Now, I thought this was just a tropical disease, but it turns out it was endemic to southern Ontario and north to Ottawa in the 1800s. Now, this is a disease I'm all too familiar with. You see, I caught malaria when I was a volunteer and living in Cameroon, Africa. It's quite nasty. Life would have been pretty hard for those early settlers fighting recurring bouts of this killer disease. Now, thankfully, it disappeared from Canada in the 1900s as more land was cleared and wetlands were drained and eventually being eradicated in the 50s with DDT. Anyway, back to the early history of Bytown and Cumberland. So between the sawmills and the canal building, this area was a growing concern back in the 1830s. The canal was completed in 1831. It's 125 miles long and has 47 locks. It's an amazing piece of engineering. It's really worth seeing. And much of the canal structure and the locks are still original, and a tour of the towns and the countryside is well worth it. Now, Cumberland was originally incorporated as a township in 1800 as part of Russell County. It took its name from the Duke of Cumberland, later the King of Hanover. Now, I had to look it up. You see, although Hanover was ruled by the British monarchy at the time, it's actually part of what is now Germany. Fascinating. Now, there were no settlers in Cumberland that came from the British upper class of society, let alone royalty, with, of course, the possible exception of our Scotsman Archibald Petrie. Now, during the War of 1812, Petrie was a purser on ships patrolling Lake Ontario, and he served as captain in the local militia during the Upper Canada Rebellion of 1837. The Petrie Islands are named after this Scottish-Canadian, Captain Archibald Petrie of the Royal Navy. Now, like many officers at the time, he received land from the Crown after leaving the military, and he settled in Cumberland. He became a prominent local merchant and politician. Now, Petrie built the first road link between Bytown, which is now Ottawa, and Montreal. It was actually a toll road, turns out. This was common at the time to have toll roads. Now, the Petrie Islands in the Ottawa River right here at Cumberland are named after Captain Petrie. It's a gorgeous park. It's an ecological reserve owned by the city. And I walk the trails every chance I get. It's beautiful. And I've been thinking about doing a special episode on Petrie Island. Now, much of the land in Cumberland Township was granted to these United Empire Loyalists, or militiamen who had served in the War of 1812. But for whatever reason, none of them ever came to stake their claim, except, of course, Captain Petrie. Now, the settlements in Upper Canada, as it's now called Ontario, were mostly along the north shore of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. In the 1790s, after the American War of Independence, the offer of land and low taxes, which of course were 1/4 those of America, it resulted in the arrival of 30,000 Americans who were referred to as late loyalists. Now, how things have changed, Canada with lower taxes than the U.S., who knew? Anyway, by the outbreak of the War of 1812, there were 110,000 people living in Upper Canada. 20,000 were the initial loyalists, 60,000 were the American immigrants, the late arrivals, and 30,000 were immigrants from the UK or descendants from the Quebecois. Now, by the way, as an aside, did you know that the War of 1812, between what would later become Canada and the U.S., it's the only war the U.S. has ever lost? Look it up. Fascinating piece of history. Now, the United Empire Loyalists were a surprisingly effective fighting force. They actually burned down the White House. In the end, they'd captured Maine and most of the upper New York state. They also took control of Michigan territories in the Battle of Detroit. Now, it would be the Treaty of Ghent, signed in 1814, that would see the British return all the captured territory to the U.S. You're welcome. Now, even though our veterans from the War of 1812, they never came, of course, with the exception of Captain Petrie, the area was eventually settled by American entrepreneurs and French Canadians, Scottish, and Irish farmers. The land was predominantly tall white pine forest, and at the time, logging was really the order of the day. A fellow by the name of Walter Beckworth, he built the first sawmill, and the French-Canadian Roman Catholic family, Amabel Foubert, they trapped and farmed and cut logs all along the township. There was even a Hudson's Bay trading post located not far from where our ranch is. It was actually a group of Irish Anglicans who cut the road into the rear of the township, near the Dutton land, and established Bear Brook. It's a small farming community, and it's there to this day. Now, when the regional municipality of Ottawa-Carleton was created in 1969, Cumberland Township became part of Ottawa-Carleton, specifically the eastern portion of the suburban Orleans area. The soon-to-be Dutton Ranch was part of a large farm operation up until 2002, when multiple 5-acre parcels were severed off for rural development, or R1 zoning. That allows for small horse ranches and hobby farms. As you can see, the land's been left untouched probably since it was severed 20 years ago. Small trees and bushes have grown in, and they'll need to be cleared. It looks as if all the fields were plowed into wide furrows and left without leveling from a disc harrow or similar implement. I think it'd be a challenge to clear and level this land. If you have any suggestions, I mean, leave them in the comments sections. We could use the help. Anyway, here's a few shots of the land in the winter. It's easier to see the small trees and the slope of the land when it's not overgrown with weeds. Here's my son. He's walking the north boundary of the property. I'm pretty sure we'll be getting some snowmobiles to take advantage of the snowy winters we have here. Now, the property looks quite different in the summertime. Very overgrown. You can see what I mean when I say clearing the land is going to be a challenge. Now, in the last video, we saw that we bought a tractor in hopes we might do this ourselves. The jury's still out on that plan. Wish us luck. So as you can see, we're now well into the fall, and since we hope to start building in the spring of 2022, there's a lot that needs to be done. I'm told that getting building permits approved by the city can take 3 to 4 months, and with development fees, that can cost upwards of 30 grand. Yes, for my American viewers, it's not easy or cheap to build in Canada. You might own the land, but the government taxes and controls everything you do with it. So if you want to break ground in April or May, we got to get our application submitted in January. That means final architectural designs and engineering in the next month or two. We need house and outbuilding designs, septic system design, grading plans, structural, mechanical engineering, etc. I mean, things are getting kind of hectic right now. But that's where we are for right now. We're forging ahead. I'll be sure to update you with our progress. I'm actually kind of excited about the house designs and letting you follow along as we start shopping for all those things that go into building the Dutton Ranch. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this journey through the Canadian history, and at least as told by that retired guy. And now make sure you're subscribed to the channel and don't miss out on this grand adventure. And until next time, live your best life.